Hi, welcome back to part two of The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood, a very famous British ghost story. Part two, and featuring the Grammy nominated music of Catherine Duke, the Seventh Chamber song. Catherine Duke. Thank you for tuning into part two, where Aunt Julia and her nephew Shorthouse are walking up to the second floor when they hear some ghastly sounds that have haunted them, and their spine chilling nerves and the hairs on the back of their neck stood up. They heard some booming noises of the shuddering of heavy doors and then the sharp catching of the latch. "What in the devil is that noise?" said Shorthouse briefly. "We must go back and see." Somehow his aunt followed him, even though her nerves did not want to see what was behind there. When they entered the front drawing room, it was plain that the folding doors had been closed half a minute before. Their nerves were steady. Without hesitation, Shorehouse opened them. He almost expected to see someone facing him in the back room, but only darkness and cold air met him. They went through both rooms, finding nothing unusual. They tried in every way to make the doors close themselves, but there was not wind enough even to set the candle flame flickering. The doors would not move without strong pressure. All was silent as the grave. Undeniably, the rooms were utterly empty and the house utterly still. How could that be that the doors shut and opened by themselves, making all that commotion? House was thinking. "It's beginning," whispered a voice at Shorehouse's elbow, which he hardly recognized as his aunt's. He nodded acquaintances, taking out his watch to note the time. It was 15 minutes before midnight. He made the entry of exactly what had occurred in his notebook, setting the candle in its case upon the floor in order to do so. It took a moment or two to balance it safely against the wall. Aunt Julie had always declared at this moment she was not actually watching him, but had turned her head towards the inner room where she fancied she heard something moving. But at any rate, both positively agreed that there came a sound of rushing feet, heavy and very swift, and the next instant the candle was out. But to Shorehouse himself had come more than this, and he'd always thanked his fortunate stars that when it came to him alone and not to his aunt too, for as he rose from the stooping position of balancing the candle, and before it was actually extinguished, a face thrust itself forward so close to his own that it could almost have touched it with his lips. It was a face working with passion, a man's face, dark with thick features and angry, savage eyes. It belonged to a common man. It was evil in ordinary, normal expression, no doubt, but as he saw it alive with intense, aggressive emotion, it was malignant and terrible human countenance. There was no movement of air, nothing but the sound of rushing feet, stockinged or muffled feet, the apparition of the face, and the almost simultaneous extinguishing of the candle. In spite of himself, Shorehouse uttered a little cry, nearly losing the balance as his aunts clung to him with her whole weight on one of her real uncontrollable terrors. She made no sound, but simply seized him boldly. Fortunately, however, she had seen nothing, but had only heard the rushing feet, for her control remained almost at once, and he was able to detangle himself and strike a match and light the candle. The shadow ran away on all sides before the glare, and his aunt stooped down and groped for the cigar case with the precious candle. Then they discovered that the candle had not been blown out at all, but had been crushed out. The wick was pressed down into the wax, which was flattened as if by some smooth, heavy instrument. "Why, this wick has been crushed!" How his companion so quickly overcame her terror, Shorthouse never properly understood, but his admiration for her aunt's self-control increased tenfold at that time to serve to feed his own dying flame, for which he was undeniably grateful. Equally inexplicable to him was the evidence of physical force they had just witnessed. At once suppressed the memory of stories he had heard of the physical mediums and their dangerous phenomena. For if these were true, and either his aunt or himself was unwittingly a physical medium, it meant that they were simply aiding to focus the forces of a haunted house ready charged to the brim. It was like walking with unprotected lamps among uncovered stores of gunpowder. So, with as little reflection as possible, he simply relit the candle and went up to the next floor with his aunt in his arms. The arm in his trembled, it is true, and his own tread was often uncertain, but they went on with thoroughness, and after a search revealed nothing, they climbed the last flight of stairs to the top floor. Here they found a perfect nest of small servants' rooms, with broken pieces of furniture, dirty cane-bottomed chairs, chests of drawers, cracked mirrors, and decrepit bedsteads. The room had low, sloping ceilings, and already hung there were cobwebs, small windows, and badly plastered walls, a depressing and dismal region which they were glad to leave behind quickly. It was the stroke of midnight when they entered a small room on the third floor close to the top of the stairs and arranged to make themselves comfortable for the remainder of their adventure. It was absolutely bare and was said to be the room then used as a clothes closet to which the infuriated groom had chased his victim and finally caught her. Outside, across the narrowing landing, began the stairs leading to the floor above and the servants' quarters where they had just searched. In spite of the chilliness of the night, there was something in the air of this room that cried for an open window. But there was more than this. Shorthouse could only describe it by saying that he felt less master of himself here than any part of the house. There was something that acted directly on the nerves, tiring the resolution, enfeebling the will. He was conscious of this result before he could have been in the room 5 minutes, and it was in the short time they stayed there that he suffered the wholesale depletion of his vital forces, which was for himself the chief horror of the whole experience. He had seen a face, that vile face. It was so close to his. They put the candle on the floor of the cupboard, leaving the door a few inches ajar, so that there was no glare to confuse the eyes and no shadow to shift about on wall and ceiling. Then they spread the cloak on the floor and sat down to wait with their backs against the wall. Shorthouse was within 2 feet of the door on the landing. His position commanded a good view of the main staircase leading down into the darkness, and also of the beginning of the servants' stairs going to the floor above. The heavy stick lay before him with his easy reach in case any would come about. The moon was now high above the house. Through the open window they could see the comforting stairs like friendly eyes watching in the sky. One by one the clock of the town struck midnight. Ding, 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 ding. And when the sounds died away, the deep silence of the windless night fell against over everything. Only the bloom of the sea far away and lugubrious, filled with air, with hollow murmurs. Inside the house, the silence became awful, awful quietness. Oh, he thought, because any minute now it might be broken by sound, portending terror. The strain of waiting told more and more severely on the nerves. They talked in whispers, when they talked at all, for their voices aloud sounded queer and unnatural. A chilliness not altogether due to the night air invaded the room and made them cold. It was so cold, very cold. The influences against them, whatever these might be, were slowly robbing them of self-confidence and the power of decision, action. Their forces were on the wane, and the possibility of real fear took on a new and terrible meaning. He began to tremble for the elderly woman by his side, whose pluck could hardly save her beyond a certain extent. He heard the blood singing in his veins. It sometimes seemed so loud that he fancied it preventing his heart hearing properly certain other sounds that were beginning very faintly to make themselves audible in the depths of the house. Every time he fastened his attention on these sounds, they instantly ceased. They certainly came no nearer. Yet he could not rid himself of the idea that movement was going on somewhere in the lower regions of the house. The drawing room floor, where the doors had been strangely closed, seemed too near. The sounds were further off than that. He thought of the great kitchen with the scurrying black beetles and of the dismal little scullery. But somehow or other they did not seem to come from there either. Surely they were not outside the house. Then suddenly the truth flashed into his mind. and for a space of minutes he felt of his blood had stopped flowing and turned into ice. The sounds were not downstairs at all. They were upstairs somewhere among those horrid, gloomy little servants' room and their bits of broken furniture, low ceilings, and cramped windows, upstairs where the victim had been disturbed and stalked to her death. And the moment he discovered where the sounds were, he began to hear them more clearly. It was the sound of feet moving steadfastly along the passage overhead and in and out of the rooms and past furniture. He turned quickly to steal a glance at the motionless figure seated beside him to note whether she had shared his discovery. Did his aunt hear and see what he is hearing? The faint candlelight coming through the crack of the cupboard door threw her strongly marked face into vivid relief against the white of the wall. But it was something else that made him catch his breath and stare again. An extraordinary something had come into her face and seemed to spread over her features like a mask. It stood out the deep lines and drew the skin everywhere a little tighter so the wrinkles disappeared. It brought into her face the sole exception of the old eyes, an appearance of youth and almost of childhood. He stared in speechless amazement that was dangerously near to horror. It was his aunt's face indeed, but it was a face of 40 years ago, the vacant, innocent face of a girl. He had heard stories of that strange effect of terror which could wipe a human countenance clean of their emotions, obliterating all previous expressions, but he had never realized that it could literally be true or could mean anything so simply horrible as what he now saw. For the dreadful signature of overmastering fear was written plainly in the utter vacancy of the girlish face beside him, and when feeling his intense gaze, she turned to look at him, he just instantly closed his eyes tightly to shut out the sight. Yet when he turned a minute later, his feeling well in hand, he saw to his intense relief another expression. His aunt was smiling, and though the face was deathly white, the awful veil had lifted, and the normal look was returning. Anything wrong was all he could think to say. I feel cold and a little frightened. He offered to close the window, but she seized hold of his hand, begged him not to leave her side for even an instant. It's upstairs, I know, but I can't possibly go up now. But Shorthouse thought otherwise, knowing that in the action lay their best hope of self-control. He took the brandy flask and poured out a glass of neat spirit, stiff enough to help anybody over anything, to calm his nerves. Here, Aunt, take this. She swallowed it with a little silver. His only idea now was to get rid of the house, get out of the house before her collapse became inevitable. But this could not safely be done by turning tail and running from the enemy. And action was no longer possible. Every minute he was growing less master of himself, and desperate, aggressive measures were imperative without further delay. Moreover, the action must be taken towards the empty, not away from it. The climax, if necessary and unavoidable, would have to be faced boldly. He could not do it now, but in 10 minutes he might not have the force left to act for himself, but such less for both. Upstairs the sounds were meanwhile becoming louder and noisier and closer, accompanied by occasional creaking of the boards. Somebody was moving steadily about the house, stumbling now and awkwardly against the furniture. Creak, 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 creak. Yes, there's something in the house. Now, Aunt Julia, we'll go upstairs and find out what all this noise is about. She must come too. Is that what we agreed? He picked up his big stick and went up to the cupboard for the candle. A limp form rose shakily beside him, breathing in. Come on, Aunt Julia. He heard a voice say very faintly something about being ready to come. The woman's courage amazed him. It was so much greater than his own. They crossed the dark landing, avoiding with their eyes a deep black space over the banisters. They began to mount the narrow staircase, to climb up, to investigate. Oh, before they could move along or go aside, someone came rushing along the passage overhead, blundering horribly, racing madly at a full speed, 3 steps at a time, down every staircase where they stood. The steps were light and uncertain, but close behind them sounded the heavier tread of another person, and the staircase seemed to make. Oh, What is this? The two runner pursuers pursued had passed clean through them where they stood already with a thud. The boards below them had conceived first, then the other. Yet they had absolutely been nothing, not hand, not arm, not face, not even a shred of flying clothes. There came a second pause. Then the first one, the latter of the two obviously pursued one, ran with uncertain steps into a little room which Shorthouse and his aunt had just left. The heavier steps followed the lighter ones. There was sound of scuffling, gasping, and smothering screaming. Ah! Ah! And then out onto the landing came the step of a single person treading weightlessly. Then dead silence followed for a space of a half a minute, and then was heard a rushing sound through the air. It was followed by a dull crashing thud in the depths of the house below on the stone floor of the hall. Utter silence reigned after. Nothing moved. The flame of the candle was steady. It had been steady the whole time, and the air had been undisturbed by any movement whatsoever. Pacified with terror, Aunt Julie, without waiting for her companion, began fumbling her way downstairs. She was crying gently to herself, and when Shorthouse put his arm around her and half carried her, he felt she was trembling like a leaf. He went into the little room and picked up the cloak from the floor, and arm in arm, they walked very slowly without speaking a word or looking once behind them. They marched down the 3 flights of stairs into the hall. In the hall they saw nothing, but the whole way down the stairs they were conscious that someone followed them. Somebody was watching them. Step by step they went faster. It was left behind, and when they went more slowly, it caught them up. But never once did they look behind to see, and at each turning of the staircase they lowered their eyes for fear of the following horror they might see upon the stairs above. With trembling hands, Shorthouse opened the front door, and they walked out into the moonlight and drew a deep breath of cool night air blowing in from the sea. This is the shocking conclusion of The Empty House by Algernon Blackwood, a very famous British ghost story. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for more ghostly stories. If you take a second to download the podcast, subscribe, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, Storytime Fun. Check out our other podcasts. And thank you for listening. Stay tuned next week. And thank you so much. Have a beautiful day.